Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Lau China Institute at King's College London. I'm Hannah Bretherton, the Lau China Institute's Impact and Engagement Manager, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here for the special event in partnership with the National Bureau of Asian Research. The Lau China Institute is the largest China research centre in the UK, and we aim to build a greater understanding of China through research, teaching, and engagement in public dialogue. We're here today to launch the National Bureau of Asian Research's latest report, China's Digital Ambitions, a global strategy to supplant the liberal order. If you didn't get a copy of the report, make sure you do grab one. They're on the tables out the front. So a very warm welcome to our team from NBR who have joined us from Washington, and to our special guest speakers who've travelled quite a way to be here with us today. Before we get started, a quick note on today's format. So the first component of the event will be 2 panel discussions delving into the key arguments within the report. Following the panel sessions, we will then welcome a special keynote speaker, Sir John Sawyers, who's the former head of the British Secret Intelligence Service, who will be sharing his views on China's digital strategy. We will have time for audience Q&A with both the panel sessions and the keynote address, so make sure you get involved and have your questions ready. Following all of that, we would like to invite you to stay for some networking over drinks and canapes. We are also recording the event, so it will be available at a later date to share and access online. I am now very pleased to welcome the Director of the Lau China Institute, Professor Kerry Brown. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I want to welcome our colleagues from the National Bureau of Asian Research who've come from various different places. And it's great. I think this is the first event we've held in collaboration with an American partner, or an American-based partner, for over 2 years. So it's good to be back in business. It's also good to be able to launch in London the report, China's Digital Ambitions, a global strategy to supplant the liberal order. And the authors of the chapters in that report will be speaking later today. We're thinking a lot about the nature of Chinese power at the moment, all the time, particularly at the moment, and particularly towards one country. But the broader question of what is Chinese power, I think, is an enormous, important and contentious one. It's certainly opportunistic, and I think there's much in this report that shows it's taken the full opportunity offered by the virtual world. And I think it's also helpful in giving some kind of framework, and I know the report at the beginning talks about the ideas of finding some kind of workable framework because of the enormity of the issue and the fact that it is very, very new. If you think of the amount of resources in terms of money, but also people, institutionally and political commitment, so political capital too, that have been put into creating this kind of virtual power for China, it's pretty clearly going to have enormous implications. It is a slightly separate issue than the nature of Chinese power, but it's very revealing about what that power is. Because I think one description of China that I think I read a few years ago was the strange thing about Chinese power is it haunts and doesn't act. And I think in the virtual world, whatever we mean by that, and there's different kind of definitions, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, that kind of hiddenness of Chinese power becomes a bit real, although I think it is still, as this report makes clear, quite difficult to pin it down. What is true, though, is that Xi Jinping's leadership is almost like a techno-autocracy, a digital autocracy. It isn't like previous leaderships. We kind of keep on getting this language about Xi being a new Mao Zedong, but we don't know what Mao Zedong with Twitter would look like, or Weibo for that matter. It would probably have been quite interesting. But I think this has clearly given an organization like the Communist Party of China a suite of powers, resources, and opportunities which it could not pass up. It would be strange if it didn't do something with this, as other governments have clearly done. The question is really, what is it doing? I think one of the more recent kind of studies I read which was helpful about this was by, I think it's Darren Byler, on Xinjiang, on terror capitalism. The idea that not only is the digital world important for security, but it's also incredibly important for capitalism, including capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And that one of the more interesting issues is not only who institutionally gets to win within China in this kind of new digital world, but who also wins in terms of making money. And again, this report refers to companies like Huawei and also Jack Ma of Alibaba and the ways in which they operate in a highly circumscribed political space. However, the report also makes clear several times that this is not a fait accompli and comes out with some particular recommendations for those who engage with this, which is pretty much all of us and all governments, in how we can basically go forward in this world in which, of course, leaders like Xi Jinping, particularly Xi Jinping, talk about a sovereignty, a digital sovereignty or a cyber sovereignty, and are kind of creating this sort of new world where norms and kind of the sort of norms and regulations that did exist in physical space are up for negotiation and for moulding. So without further ado, I really would like to thank again our partners in this event today, and I would like to invite Michael Willis, the Vice President of the National Bureau of Asian Research, to come and say a few words. Michael, thank you very much.
Thanks, Kerry. It truly is a pleasure to be back doing an event in person. My colleague and I were on our last trip was March 2020 in Canberra and Wellington, just as the pandemic was beginning to spread, and it's wonderful to be back on the road and doing an event here in London. My name is Michael Wills, Executive Vice President of the National Bureau of Asian Research. We are an independent policy research institution, a US institution, similar, I suppose, to Chatham House here in London, a think tank that is working with independent experts to inform the policy process and help government leaders make good decisions. But three distinguishing characteristics about NBR. The first is that within the US, we're actually bi-coastal. We have an office in Washington, D.C., and a lot of our team is based there and spent a lot of time talking to members of Congress and their staff, to the Department of State, the Department of Defense, National Security, the White House. But we also have an office in Seattle, which is where I'm based. And so we have a footprint that's looking west out across the Pacific, and we do a lot of work with partner governments in the region. The second distinguishing characteristic about NBR is that our geographic focus is exclusively the Asia-Pacific region. We understand that broadly. We include the Indian Ocean. We actually include Russia. For 30 years, we've viewed Russia as a major Asian power. And so the current situation in Ukraine is something that we're tracking quite closely, not so much in how it's affecting European security, but some of the demonstration effects that the crisis here might have for the security situation in East Asia. And then the third and final distinguishing characteristic about NBR is the way that we do our research. We are organized around a network of worldwide experts. So in any one year, we probably have 150 different scholars from universities and research institutions around the world who remain in their home institution but contribute to NBR research projects and do their work with us, and then we present their findings and their analysis to policymakers. And we're delighted to be partnering with the Lau Institute and King's College here today. We are launching this report, China's Digital Ambitions. As both Kerry and Hannah have said, it's available outside, it's available on our website, along with an interactive data tool that accompanies the report. 6 authors contributed analysis to this. 3 of them have traveled here today to London and will be part of the panel speaking later on. A 4th author will be joining us online. And the project was led by Emily de la Bruyère, who is a co-founder of Horizon Advisory in Washington, D.C., and a non-resident fellow with NBR. I won't steal her thunder, but let me just kind of offer a few framing remarks to help you understand the context of this report and some of the key conclusions that we've found. And the way Emily describes it, I think, is very helpful. So there's sort of a bottom-up dimension of what China is doing. The build-out of digital infrastructure, which is both physical infrastructure, telecommunications networks, satellite networks, the role of Chinese technology companies as they're moving out globally and becoming major commercial players. But that's complicated by the particular role and relationship that those tech companies have with the Chinese state, which is very different from the kind of relationship that major commercial companies in the West have with their respective governments. That bottom-up approach is increasing China's digital influence globally. At the same time, there's a top-down dimension, which is a Chinese government-led effort to change the norms around technology governance. And this is through being very active in technology standard-setting bodies. It's through shaping norms and discussions at the UN and elsewhere. And so this bottom-up and top-down are kind of both making a major impact on the digital space, which, as Kerry noted, is an important and growing part of all of our lives, both in terms of our social lives, our business lives, and a whole range of other areas. And I think the implications of this, I would argue, are threefold. There are obviously very clear commercial implications. We're not talking about a level playing field where tech companies, irrespective of the country they come from, are in a sort of common marketplace. The kind of relationship that Chinese technology companies have with their government, the kind of actions that the Chinese government is taking are helping to kind of provide an extra advantage to those companies in ways that may not be helpful for Western commercial entities. There are very real political and military and security concerns about China's digital activities. And its ability to potentially manipulate flows of data, to change the information space, to engage in propaganda and disinformation in ways that you'll hear about this afternoon from some of our speakers. Fundamentally, though, I think we're talking about an ideological difference. We're talking about a world in which Xi Jinping is confident. He's got a vision of China's role in the world, of a sort of a world that is safe for authoritarian governments to organize and control certain things. And it's very different from the visions we have in the West, whether that's here in London, whether that's across Europe, whether that's in the United States, whether that's in Australia. We all have our differences, of course, but there's a common playing field, or a common sense that the role of government should be limited, that there's a role for freedom of information, and this is a very different vision than the one that we're seeing come out of from China right now. So bottom line, our authors argue that China's digital ambitions do pose a very real challenge to the Western order. It's one that demands a response. It's a response, though, that's difficult to achieve in many ways because we are so less coordinated here in the West than the Chinese state is right now. And so in addition to public events like this, what our group has been doing here in London, was doing in Paris last week, and will be doing virtually with counterparts in Seoul and Tokyo and elsewhere, is engaging governments that are kind of trying to grapple with these questions themselves and figure out how we can get like-minded countries to at least be on the same page in understanding the nature of the problem, and then hopefully searching for appropriate solutions. So let me stop there, and I will turn the floor to our first panel. Kerry, I'm going to have you come back up to the stage with our first panel of speakers. Emily de la Bruyère, Marc Marmino, and Nigel Cory will be joining us online.
Right, so we'll talk in the order. Is that okay?
Recording in progress.
You first, then Nigel, and then Mark. Is that okay? Great. Well, look, thank you very much, everyone. I think Nigel is with us. Can you hear us okay? And yeah, okay, good. So the first panel is about China's global digital ambitions. And the first speaker will be one of the editors and authors of the report, Emily de la Bruyère. She is co-founder of Horizon Advisory, a consulting firm focusing on the implications of China's competitive approach to geopolitics, as well as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Emily.
Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I have the easy gig because I get to go very high-level framing of China's strategy, which is detail light and fear-mongering heavy. The basic argument that we present in this report and that I think is critical to understanding what China's doing in the digital space and also more broadly is that China has diagnosed a new industrial revolution underway. This industrial revolution is catalyzed by the emergence of data as a factor of production. And per Beijing's calculus, what this means is that there's going to be a reshuffling of the global order and a rewriting of the global rules. And this provides China a chance not just to rise within the existing paradigm, but actually to reshape the paradigm and to create a structure that advantages China and Chinese players. And the way to do so is by controlling data. At a first level, that means cementing superior access to information. For example, controlling the networks or the architectures over which data flows, as well as locking in access to companies' data. But at a next order, China's vision also includes an effort to influence or to shape how data moves where to whom at what pace according to what rules. Because if China can do that, it can determine how every other factor of production is produced, consumed, and distributed. China can determine how and where resources move. Commerce takes place, military engagement is carried out, propaganda and misinformation are targeted. This idea about data as a factor of production, about an industrial revolution, it's not unique if you look at other fields. This is what the whole buzzword or buzz phrase of data as a new oil is about. And it's what companies have realized and are competing for based on the strategic advantage of data and control over it. But what Beijing is doing is novel in that China is applying it to nation-state competition and to the geopolitical framework. And therefore, the implications of China's calculus are far greater. If Beijing succeeds, it means that it could lock in not only a superior information to target and disseminate misinformation and propaganda, the way, for example, social media companies have been accused of doing. China would also be able to cement an advantage in economic interactions for its companies because they would get superior information, but also be privileged in the information space. In the military domain, China could have superior information on the battlefield, but also to be able to coerce or deny that of the adversary. And overall, therefore, we get a world in which not only does China have this cemented advantage, but Beijing shapes how all other players are carrying out their activities or trying to compete. As Michael mentioned, we see this being carried out by Beijing from both a bottom-up changing facts on the ground and a top-down writing the rules perspective, with the latter largely a question of standards and digital governance. But one more beat, and then I feel like I'm talking too long, but another really important part of this is that China has structural advantages that in this contest may allow it to be uniquely competitive and may prove uniquely determinative vis-a-vis other past contests like that for technology before the digital era. China's size is one of these, its centralization, and also its industrial capacity. Chinese systems are bigger than other ones, and that really matters in a digital space. China's centralization lets it use the private sector to carry out its ambitions in a world where, to borrow a phrase from one of my co-authors, commerce is the battlefield. And China's industrial capacity lets it influence the international private sector so that they don't compete or engage with China's strategy as cooperative players. China's industrial capacity also simply gives it what it needs to control international value chains or build out international infrastructures. Which leaves us in a scary competitive playing field, and one that perhaps more than any other challenge I can imagine demands multilateral cooperation among like-minded players at a first order in terms of shaping what a positive digital environment looks like, and a next order in terms of actually competing to shape that. That's what I got.
Great, thank you very much. So the second speaker will be Nigel Cory, an Associate Director at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, where he focuses on cross-border data flows, data governance, intellectual property, and how they relate to digital trade and the broader digital economy. And he previously worked for 8 years in Australia's Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade. Nigel. You're on mute. Or we haven't got you set up right.
No.
Okay.
Good morning, good afternoon. Apologies for that. Firstly, thanks Professor Brown, Michael and Hannah for the invitation and helping arrange for today's event. I wish I could be there in person, but in part my wife is 37 as China's efforts to play a role in global data governance is nascent and evolving, but increasingly well articulated and prosecuted. In the last 5 years, we've seen a noticeable shift in China's approach from one that was mainly solely focused, internally focused, perhaps best defined by the Great Firewall of China, to one that is increasingly engaged externally. In particular, China's global data advocacy took an evolutionary step forward with the 2020 launch of the Global Initiative on Data Security, GIDS. GIDS sort of articulated China's international data strategy, which is essentially based on the principle of state and cyber sovereignty, where governments can easily take whatever actions they deem necessary. It's essentially about control. China's new cybersecurity law, its personal information protection law, and data security law provide a comprehensive legal framework for data governance in China. And while these do address some legitimate commercial issues, they provide a no effective check on the government's ability to control data. In analysing China's approach, it's important to highlight that data will naturally flow across borders as part of the global internet, absent artificial barriers and controls, which is what China has essentially been enacting over the last 2 decades. China is a world leader in forcing firms to only store data locally within the country's borders, a concept known as data localization, with dozens of laws and regulations that make it illegal or prohibitively costly and complicated to transfer data overseas. China has expanded local data storage and in many cases local control over data to a growing range of specific data types like banking, genomic, health, mapping, scientific and other categories of data, but also to broad categories of undefined sort of data types of important or strategic data. Now, this contrasts with that of most other countries that accept that responsibility for privacy or cybersecurity or other legal responsibilities should move and flow with the data wherever it's stored. Now, what's at stake in this battle over the flow of data is nothing less than a central feature of the internet with significant implications for global trade and innovation, as the free flow of data is crucial to success in today's data-driven economy, which increasingly depends on how well firms can leverage data to generate new insights, to support trade, to engage with people. It also has obvious social and political implications. Now, coming to the issue late has not really disadvantaged China because it's still a relatively new issue, that being global data governance. So how successful China will be depends on whether the United States, the United Kingdom and other like-minded countries are in stepping up their game in countering China's efforts and also developing and advocating for alternative approaches that protect the free flow of data and digital trade and data-driven innovation, as well as the broader goal of a free and open internet. I should also note on this, I'm a part of the UK DCMS's International Data Transfer Expert Council to basically try and help the UK do the opposite in terms of create new agreements and provisions to protect the free flow of data around the world. Now, I'll briefly mention a few examples of China's evolving approach to international data governance that I obviously go into more detail in the actual book. China favours multilateral institutions like the United Nations and the International Telecommunications Union as they provide voting power to governments, thus lending itself to China's focus on state sovereignty. It also makes it easier for China to marginalise the private sector and public advocacy groups. The ITU scales even more readily than the UN as private firms, as sector members, have a seat at the table. China can, as one official put it to me, flood the zone in ensuring that it has as many participants and proposals in as many forums as possible. This sort of death by 1,000 cuts approach is a coordinated strategy by China to get its preferred language embedded in a broad sweeping sort of agenda at these multilateral institutions. China and Russia also want to use these cyber discussions at the ITU and the UN to push a broader agenda, or as one official described it to me, to engage in so-called issue creep around cybercrime and cybersecurity, which they actually want to be much broader to deal with internet governance and the digital economy more broadly. For example, in 2019, Huawei officials proposed a new top-down centralised design for internet governance called the New Internet Protocol. And while it was sort of derided at the time because it didn't sort of stand up to close scrutiny, it still provides a useful example of China's approach in that they did deploy some of their tools bilaterally and at the multilateral arena to build support amongst member economies, including in Africa, for their proposal. But given the criticism and the opposition it faced from the United States and others, China broke the proposal down into pieces to propose in ITU committees and study groups, thus making it harder for countries that oppose it to track and counter its every occurrence. In terms of bilateral engagement, China is having a direct and indirect impact on individual countries' domestic development of data governance frameworks. What we've seen is that private Chinese firms like AliCloud and Tencent Cloud are publicly and privately advocating for data localization in India, in Indonesia and elsewhere, in part to differentiate themselves from US and other foreign cloud providers, which will obviously take a more legalistic approach to requests for data. And so officials in these countries look to these Chinese providers as a more ready partner because they are concerned about access to data. But what we see also more broadly is that Chinese firms, sometimes working hand in glove with the Chinese government, are advocating for Chinese regulations alongside development projects and infrastructure projects around the world, including as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And so, as I described in the chapter, we've seen sort of like, obviously a lot of the attention focused on ICT infrastructure deployment in Africa and elsewhere, which in many cases is addressing a legitimate need. But what we've increasingly seen is the corresponding push and pull of regulatory sort of advocacy. And so we've seen data localization and restrictive approaches to content management online pop up in Tanzania, Senegal, and elsewhere in Africa. And I think we'll see more of that in the future. In terms of China's approach to dealing with data and digital trade, up until recently, they hadn't really dealt with data in their trade agreements. They defined it as e-commerce in terms of small packages crossing borders and focusing on trade facilitation and customs. It was only with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, trade agreement, that they made their first commitments on data. But these themselves were actually meaningless because they were not subject to dispute settlement, and so they weren't enforceable. But they are a step in the direction of China articulating how it will deal with these issues internationally, especially at the e-commerce negotiations at the World Trade Organization. And what is, I think, will eventually happen is that while the negotiations haven't gotten to data yet, because it's a particularly sensitive and tricky issue, and they're trying to sort of achieve consensus on easier issues, is that China will seek a self-judging exception for national security so it can essentially maintain its current approach. And it will have a greater chance of doing this if Europe is able to achieve a self-judging exception for privacy. And so China will sort of try and piggyback off Europe's approach there. And so with that, I'll end it there. Again, thank you for the opportunity to speak. Happy to talk about any of my recommendations in the following Q&A with Emily and the other panels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And then finally, Marc Marmino, who is a PhD candidate at the Lau Institute and is doing his PhD on this, broadly on this area. So, Marc.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the NBR and the Lau for having me speak here today. I am not a report writer, but I did want to echo the congratulations to the team on a fantastic report, as well as the online database tool, which is equally fantastic. So I study young adult compliance to specific forms of digital pandemic surveillance. And so what does that mean, and how does that report, how does that relate to the overall report? Well, think track and trace technologies such as contact tracing apps, and in the case of the PRC, that's the Digital Health Code or Health Code. Essentially a mini program that's able to run on smartphones and generate a QR code for users in sort of a traffic light fashion, green, yellow, and red, that allows them either mobility or access to indoor venues. And that app itself runs on top of what the report here calls super apps. And so this is like increasingly necessary and widely popular apps such as WeChat and Alipay. And so I'll first provide some context on the domestic surveillance situation in China, because I think it lends to what could be potentially exported as well. So it starts with the form of digital enclosure. So via the Great Firewall that we all know about. But this is where the Chinese population is subject to information only contained within the Great Firewall. It essentially turns the worldwide internet into an intranet, or what's dubbed the China net. And then within the confinement of that information, there are state sentinels that monitor. So these are groups of netizens, namely the Wumaodong. They monitor and patrol the intranet for any sentiment that is not aligned with the party's message. And those groups go out and they attempt to positively reshape the narrative around these policies through commenting or attacking the commenter themselves, and through posting non-aligned and dissenting messages. So there are several other biometric surveillance tools that I could mention at this point, including CCTV and some facial recognition and AI integration going on, as well as retina scans. And if you're interested in that kind of work, I would also echo Carrie's recommendation to look at the work of Darren Byler on that and what's going on in Xinjiang. There's also a media politics aspect of it. There's a state-controlled media outlets and their ability to shape narratives for the party as well. And then there's the still developing but infamous social credit system, which is incomplete, but by my last read, I think there's 43 pilot programs. But it represents a significant tool to name and shame and ostracize individuals who violate trustworthiness with their behavior. The social credit system itself includes red lists for positive behavior, but also blacklists for trust-breaking behavior. And if you're a blacklisted individual, those lists can get posted online, and they can also be, in certain towns and villages, posted on public billboards, right? And so it's this form of public shaming for misdeeds. And that's a really powerful thing. The power of shame and the ability to be shamed really resonates, especially with the young adults that I've interviewed in my own research in China. So avoiding shame and stigma to a lot of them is more important than even the legal consequences that the government could deliver to them, which I think is really interesting. It drives attitudes towards compliance towards these forms of technology. Every type of surveillance that I mentioned in those earlier remarks can be resisted, right? You can take a screenshot of a QR code that was green previously. You can obviously use a VPN or a dual SIM to get around the firewall. And you can self-censor, use coded language, or even emojis to get around the Wumaodang, those sentinels I mentioned. The biometric tools under refinement by the Chinese state are much more complicated to resist. That is to say that citizens subjected to these forms of surveillance can and do sometimes resist. Individual agency is a huge component of determining the effectiveness of these compulsory forms of surveillance. I find in my own research that the digital tools are merely just one part of a more complex social construct around digital surveillance, one that is uniquely influenced by culture. That's to say that the values and society, the values of the societies that these tools are imposed upon are critical to understanding their overall adoption and integration success, and perhaps might even offer some hope as a gating factor in terms of their export potential. In terms of export potential, the multi-use and the specific technologies that I look at, I think that these pandemic surveillance technologies have great potential to be incorporated into future forms of social control, which could ultimately be globally exported as well. One of the themes of the report is data-driven governance and the idea that domestic surveillance tools are a means for government to control and track the population. The health code is compulsory. That I mentioned is compulsory. It's widely used inside China, and it gives potential for nefarious applications in the future. Why is that? Because many Chinese are comfortable with it. Many truly support the government's use of it because it's effective in controlling the pandemic, and it delivers a benefit to their life in terms of convenience. They've registered to use it with their national ID. Excuse me. So that provides a potential horizontal integration capability with that common identification. So there's potential for convergence, as the report talks about. So these digital pandemic technologies and their potential for export are worth keeping an eye on in terms of China's global ambitions in the digital space, especially as we consider iterations of them coming out of the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. I think we've got 20 minutes for discussion. I'll maybe ask a couple of questions and then I'd be happy to open it up. I don't know if we've got a roving microphone. We've got a roving microphone. Okay, well, I'll summon that in a minute. So Emily, I mean, as I understand it, the threat is that China, in terms of influencing the global regulatory environment, might fix things in such a way that it's benign for China's interests. Is that the threat, or is there some different kind of threat?
I wouldn't limit it just to the regulatory environment, but I think, yes, the threat is that we end up, the digital architecture is only just taking shape. The threat is that that digital architecture ends up being something that asymmetrically benefits Chinese players and also locks in Chinese norms or visions for example, state control over the entire the world. So it's a question of benefits to both specific Chinese players, and then entering like a non-market or non-competitive environment, and the enshrinement of norms and principles that go against ours.
Okay. Is it that the way that China behaves is that it's a problematic player because it's highly intentional? It's got a very clear strategy about what it wants to do, whereas probably, as you said earlier, we're a bit kind of messier and we let this thing grow organically. Is that sort of why it's such a problematic? Not just because it's different, but because it has a very clear strategy about what it wants to do and an intention.
It has a very clear strategy. It has clear advantages in pursuing that strategy that we are very challenged to rival. The strategy goes directly against our interests on multiple different dimensions. And the strategy leverages tools that are already against what we see of as global norms or rules. For example, non-market support for companies or government acquisition of data that perhaps by our norms should be private.
Okay, Mark, so why don't we just digitally decouple? And we have, because China, as I understand it, China has created, as we know when we go to China, we used to go to China a couple of years ago before COVID, you can't operate in China you can't get to Gmail, you can't get to most of our social media. So it's like a Chinese space where you have to use WeChat and Weixin and things like this. So why don't we just sort of, kind of create a great firewall ourselves and keep China out?
Yeah, I think it's important that that we engage with China and continue to engage with our digital tools. But I think that has been romanticized over the years in terms of what these digital tools will do as China, especially their middle class, continues to get access to increasing information, become increasingly educated, and their disposable incomes go up. Based on modernization theory, the thought was that eventually this would drive towards democratization in China. However, China has proven to be a thorn in that theory. I think by 2024 they'll be the longest-serving communist party of governance in the world history. So they have continually defied modernization theory, and that's despite the allowance of tools such as Gmail and Yahoo and the ones that you've mentioned. So while tricky, I think it's still worth having them there, especially as Westerners travel there and need to access their own Gmail, right? But you raise a good point. I do think that that one of the recommendations in the report, one of the policy recommendations, is for the United States to develop almost a GDPR type protection in terms of people's personal data. And I think that's important for a couple reasons, because one being protection of personal data being important, but then also, I guess in my own research, I have seen young adults in China equivocate the factors of surveillance capitalism, this idea that these corporations, as you mentioned, like Google and Facebook, that they collect on individuals based on likes and preferences, and then they use that data to sell ads, right? So this idea that, so when I say to them, what does it mean to you to have privacy, or how do you conceptualize privacy from the state? They say that it's no different than what some of these companies, these U.S. companies based in Silicon Valley, do. And so I think it's important from an example perspective as well that digital democracy is this beacon, and that Western companies like the ones you mentioned are able to have a stronger sense of protecting personal data.
The house upon a virtual hill. Good. Nigel, what do you want to have sort of different as a result of the publication of this report, I mean, clearly you're sort of proposing that things, I mean, there's proposals in it, but what's the key thing that needs to happen, do you think, in order to address the issues that you've all talked about?
I mean, firstly, there needs to be a recognition or an awareness of what China's now trying to do in advocating for its approach internationally, which it hadn't really done before. And to recognise that we're in the UK, the US, and other sort of like-mindeds are in a particularly precarious spot because they themselves cannot agree on how to address some of these issues around data privacy, cybersecurity, and everything. And so it's China's sort of stepping into this vacuum in a way, and the countries that should be working together aren't always on the same page. Obviously, best shown by the EU-US dispute over data flows with the various streams disputes. And so there needs to be a greater recognition that whatever relatively minor disputes there are between, say, the US and EU, these pale in comparison between the US, EU, and that of digital authoritarian countries like Russia and China, in that they have much more in common than they probably sometimes care to admit on these issues, despite the conflicts, and much more to share in common to address together in terms of defining and articulating the global digital economy and internet that they want to see, as opposed to the vision and the strategy that China is advocating for.
Thank you. So this is a very unfair question, but I'm going to ask it because I'm very curious. Reading the report, it is about China, for sure. And there's not a huge amount of comparative work in it, though that might be something you're working on. So I have a very simple question. Standing in March 2022, which is a greater threat to American democracies, American-based entity, Facebook or the Communist Party of China? Emily.
Communist Party of China. Zero question.
Because?
Facebook acts in its commercial interests. That creates, Facebook has the risk of creating harm. Let's take that as an assumption, although, yeah, there's that threat. Facebook's ambitions are to make money. Facebook is bound by a regulatory and a reputational environment that are going to constrain its action and make sure that it, at least up to a certain extent, does mitigate the threats it can create. Facebook also operates in a relatively limited domain and is not going to create threat outside of that. Leave it there for a second. China seeks authoritarian control over the global system to include military, commerce, society, information, which I'm going to separate out as a different thing. China is bound by no international regulatory or reputational concerns. In fact, it has thrown those to the wind. China operates across every possible domain, using companies that, taken together, collect and aggregate and disseminate far more information than Facebook does or ever will. And they're placed under the monopolistic control of the Chinese Communist Party. And China operates globally. One beat farther, so I would say far greater threat right there. The next beat is, how do you respond to this? There are certain things about what we're saying that are inevitable in terms of how a digital world will evolve. Data will be valuable. It will be in players' interests to collect and to disseminate it. We will rely on data. We will increasingly operate in a world where our physical interactions are determined by virtual movements. Those aren't great things in a lot of ways. Those also are things that end up rewarding size or scale, something that is turning our assumptions about markets and who can control what on their heads. If we're going to respond to China's threats, we need to accept that that's going to be a reality. I'm saying we in terms of like-minded countries. And we also need to recognize that we have to compete in the private sector, which means competing with players like Facebook, because those are the only alternative to China's digital strategy. If those aren't in the market, there's only one set of players that's taking advantage of the resources and the potential of the digital revolution.
In which market? In
the international market that are doing
international, but not the China market.
Well, Facebook isn't in the, can't be in the China market. And so those players, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Googles of the world, like, for all of the potential risks that we can describe, or attribute to them, are the champions that can also protect against China's strategy.
Nigel, do you agree with that, or have anything to add to it?
I completely agree. I mean, there really is no comparison between a company that operates in rule of law countries and follows those and increasingly advocates for those versus a country or a party that seeks to operate however it wants to. And I think the clearest example of this is actually around the central issue I mentioned earlier, government access to data, in that the UK, the US, Europe and others are increasingly engaged in efforts on how do we create legal safeguards and transparency around this sort of core privacy surveillance issue, and how do we do so in a common way so that we're all operating to a similar extent so that we can sort of assure that our data that moves between these different jurisdictions are treated somewhat similarly. There are no safeguards. There is no rule of law. It is ruled by law in China. And China could never sort of live up to any of those types of commitments. And so that's just a clear example of how the Chinese Communist Party just is an entity sort of unlike any other as it relates to the crossover between its strategic, political and economic interests.
Great. Okay, if I could open up the discussion. The lady there, just if you could ask, if you could say who you are too, and then...
My name's Jamie White and I'm retired. But we've all been watching Russia walk all over China, Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, etc. We've been watching it.
I think there's a mic there because the guy, yeah.
We've been watching Russia's movements for years and we haven't done anything about it. Somehow Ukraine in the last 18 days has gelled some action, and yet we're all looking pretty disparate as Western democratic countries that are accountable first to our voters. We have been watching China now for 20 years, the Belt and Road, the buying up of ports, the lending of money, the walking all over Africa, the buying up of Africa, the funding of it, the lending of money to them. What is going to happen that could trigger the West to come together and realize how frightening the power base that China has by and they've grown it through their indebtedness, but they have 1.4 billion people behind them and no democracy to account for.
Well, I presume this report is meant to do something about that. Does anyone want to sort of take that, yeah, I mean, Nigel or Emily or Mark? It's a fairly broad question, yeah.
I think it will be really interesting, and we've already seen some indications that Russia's invasion of the Ukraine has changed the geostrategic calculations of individual EU member countries as well as the EU overall. And the hope would be that they recognise that, as I pointed out, that they share much more in common with the UK, the US, Japan, Australia, New Zealand and others on these digital issues than they share apart, and that there's a greater urgency for action on these issues as compared to before when they were largely focused on sort of relatively petty disputes over this. And so it will be interesting to see if that's one of the implications. We've seen some encouraging signs, but whether that actually comes to fruition in terms of when they get to the table and sort of revising some of their past positions that have been the source of this conflict and trying to figure out ways to work ahead. For example, the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, which is, I suppose, a relatively new forum for greater collaboration on trade and technology, is meeting the next time in May. And it could be the vehicle for greater alignment and cooperation on digital issues, which presents the opportunity for a real sort of concerted effort to push back against China's response. Whether that's how it's used, we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you.
I think one other thing that has the potential to create an effect, we talk so much about what the government can do to shape private sector action. The reverse mechanism is also, or just action from the private sector. So many, to use this word, but Western countries have pulled their operations from Russia over the past few weeks. That's huge. What if there was also an incentive for them to pull operations out of China? Or, I'm getting a head shake. It's far less likely, but there's a new push for incorporating environmental concerns into companies' decision making. That should also include normative concerns. And I think that the market can help encourage that kind of action by calling on companies to take that kind of move.
If we go back to the previous question, I was going to answer Facebook. No,
I was saving you. Yep, go ahead.
just kidding. No. For this, I think it's a punctuated event, and I lived here in the UK in early 2020 when we saw the reversal of Huawei, and so I think, just as the other two speakers have said, it could actually, by them showing their cards and seeing potentially alignment between Russia and China, we could see Western democracies continue to strengthen their bond and take a stand in these areas.
Great. Yeah. The lady there then. Yeah. Yeah, the lady just here, and then I think there's another one at the back. Maybe if we take a couple of them.
Hi, my name is Nikki. I'm a master's student at King's, and I was also a journalist before. So I have a question about the recent crackdown on the so-called big tech companies in China. As we have seen, over the past years, Alibaba, Tencent, all these big platform economies are facing some sort of crackdown from Beijing, and also the latest regulations like data security law also kind of limit the scope of commercial companies to collect personal data and utilize that for commercial purpose. So these are the so-called bottom-up approaches that you mentioned in the report. That mean in the future the China's digital strategy would be shifted to a more top-down approach instead? How do you make this kind of crackdown in the context of geopolitical rivalry, tech rivalry globally? Thank you.
Great, and then maybe a question at the back. I think there was someone, the gentleman at the back. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Hi, it's Andrew People from the Wire China and also the Asia Matters podcast. I'm really looking forward to reading this report and learning more about this area, such a crucial area. I feel very ignorant myself about it, so really looking forward to reading about this. I just had a couple of questions on the principle of there are no stupid questions, so I'm sorry if these sound very naive. But first one is, when you say we need to act in a more concerted way, who is we here? How many countries do you need? Is this a case of America needs to lead and sort of middle powers like Britain need to tag along, and how many, do we need India on side? Do we need Africa, African countries on side? What's the sort of critical mass of countries that are needed to take on China in this area? And the second question could be a very naive question, but is China gone here? Is this an area where we can't cooperate with China? It's over. This is a strategic competition now, or is there some common ground? Is there some room for compromise and cooperation in this area?
Thank you, Andrew. Great. So, who wants to start with the first one? Maybe the big tech companies and the torrid time they're having, which I know is referred to in the Jack Ma's case is referred to in the report. I don't know, Emily or Mark, or who wants to offer themselves up for that one?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. I think it's a really good question. I like the way you frame it in terms of what does this mean for top down, bottom up. The tech crackdown in China clearly seeks to establish state control over companies to ensure that the state can access their information, but also that even more than was already the case, their behavior is something that's controlled by or in line with the Chinese government's digital strategy. Does that mean that, so in terms of how we're framing top down versus bottom up, the first is shaping governance standards. The second is actually building the system, so changing facts on the ground. It doesn't change the fact that they will maintain this effort to use Chinese tech champions to change the facts on the ground, to build digital infrastructure, to disseminate digital platforms, but they are doing so bound far more to the Chinese state, or far more explicitly than they were before, and with their information tied more closely to the Chinese state than it was before. The timing is also just a fascinating element of this. This is clearly a window of opportunity perceived by Beijing, where the Chinese tech sector is strong enough that it can take this hit, where platform companies aren't going to be crippled, but not so strong that it can resist this hit and go off into the sunset following purely commercial interest distanced from the strategic ambitions, which is a canny bet and based on the results so far seems to have been well timed.
And Nigel, who is we?
We is anyone that values the value of an open, rules-based global digital economy and one that obviously is free and open for expression, communication, and everything else. And it's an interesting question because when we typically talk about global data governance, people frame it as like we have competing models. We have the European model and the US model and the China model, which to some extent is true, but also sort of like a false sort of binary. And so the battle, though, is amongst all of the remaining countries. That's where the contest is, that we will not change China's behaviour or approach, nor will we try and change Europe's approach. But that's not to say that Europe and the US can cooperate and align on a lot of others. And so I talk with obviously UK officials, Australian officials, Singaporean, New Zealand, Latin American officials, and it's really quite interesting because you see a growing recognition amongst these many officials that they need to pay more attention to this, both domestically but internationally, because they recognise it's a critical enabler of local success in this, and that with the rise of restrictions, they need to be paying more attention to that to build the economies of scale that they need to, that only a very few economies around the world actually have domestically. And so it's a matter of having that awareness and that they need to build newer coalitions around this in the various forums as these issues come up. That I think is part of the challenge with the recommendations we pose, is that we need to be more energised with a broader range of countries on these issues where it pops up at the UN or the ITU or the WTO, and recognising that more and more countries are paying attention to this now as opposed to say 5 years ago. But that sort of coalition building is also part of the challenge. Like how wide or small do you go? How ambitious or not do you go in trying to pull countries together onto the same page on one of many sort of digital issues?
Thank you. And then just finally, has the horse bolted? Can we cooperate with China? So maybe Marc and then Emily.
Can we cooperate with China?
Yeah.
I hope so. I really do. We're definitely, right now we definitely need to compete. So if you look at the report, some of the export situations that we have with this technology, going to Saudi Arabia, Serbia, Pakistan, Belarus, Venezuela, these aren't necessarily countries that others look to for shining examples of freedom and liberty. But I think we can offer that example, and hopefully that comes through cooperation with China as well.
Great. Emily.
Right now, China is a strategic competitor, and I think that means we have to compete with China. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's an environment when, and I'm going to use the we that Nigel explained, when we get our acts together and we have a vision of what we're trying to advance, where there is more room for engagement because we actually have a strategy. Right now, without that coordination, Beijing's able to take advantage of cooperation.
Great. Thank you very much. On that sobering note, I'd like to thank you. And then hand over to Michael for the next panel. Thanks very much. Thank you.